Welcome to WordPath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight we're going to celebrate a small victory for Oklahoma Indian languages. Some would call it a large victory, but I'll explain a little bit more about that as we discuss this. What we're celebrating is passage of Senate Concurrent Resolution 37 in the Oklahoma State Legislature. Let me back up a minute and give a little history of legislation related to Indian languages in Oklahoma. I suppose we could back up all the way to statehood, before statehood, when there was some discussion of making Oklahoma an Indian state. I wonder what the laws then would have been in regard to Indian languages. No doubt very different than they turned out to be. But looking to the more recent history, there was an English-only measure that was introduced at least once in the legislature. I believe it was before I arrived in Oklahoma in the late 80s. And I understand Senator Haney and some others, a lot of Indian people went to the Capitol and opposed this, and Senator Haney spoke against it on the Senate floor. And that measure was defeated. And as I said, I don't have the exact date. I believe that was in the 1980s. I came to Oklahoma. We founded the Intertribal Wordpath Society. And we started thinking about the fact that laws can sometimes have quite an impact on the status of Indian languages, and we wanted to promote the status of Indian languages, and we're wondering how best that could be accomplished with laws. Now, we're not a legal or political organization, but we started thinking about these things in our board meeting, and we came up with something that, a draft of a proposed measure that would, we hoped, protect Indian languages in case the English-only people came back to Oklahoma, which we knew they would. And this would, we were looking for something that would basically say, Oklahoma, wants to stand up for its Indian languages, and we don't want to pass any laws that would in any way restrict their use, as some English-only measures do propose to do. So we came up with a draft. I'll read you a little bit of it. We've had a show about this before, but I'll read you like the first few paragraphs to give you an idea of how it compares to the measure that did recently pass. We gave it a working title. It's kind of long, and it turns out this title wasn't used in the final analysis, but I'm used to calling it by this name, which is Oklahoma Indian Language Heritage Protection Act. Pretty much says exactly what it is. It has a lot of whereas clauses, as a lot of things do in the legislature, and then it ends, be it therefore resolved. Maybe I could read the whole thing. I think I'll read through the whole thing. It bears some repetition, and it's very similar to what did finally pass. So here's the proposed. This was like in 1999 or 2000 that we worked this up, between the 2 years, I believe, at the WordPath Society, and proposed it to the legislature. Let me read you what we had come up with. Whereas the state of Oklahoma is home to 38 tribes, members of which still speak 25 Native American languages, and whereas the Native American Language Act of 1990, Public Law 101-477, states that it is the policy of the United States to, quote, preserve, protect, and promote the rights and freedom of Native Americans to use, practice, and develop Native American languages, end quote. And whereas Oklahoma has more Indian citizens than any other state, whose history, cultures, and languages together comprise a unique heritage which helps to make our state great. And whereas many of our Oklahoma heroes have spoken Indian languages, and many Oklahoma youth would like to have the connection of a shared language with these heroes. And whereas Indian languages are crucial to the identity, self-esteem, and success of young Indian people, and whereas the languages of all Oklahoma tribes have often been suppressed, disrespected, and neglected to the detriment of all Oklahomans, and whereas the pressures of modern American culture as expressed in English language, television, radio, education, and public life have steadily decreased the attention paid to Indian languages by some Oklahomans, and whereas Indian history, culture, and language are so interrelated that when a language dies, it takes with it literature, oral history, song, and other important aspects of Indian cultural heritage, and whereas Oklahoma values its great diversity of native cultures and languages, as evidenced in our slogan, Oklahoma, Native America, and whereas Indian languages are just as sophisticated and just as enriching to the lives of their speakers as are Spanish, French, Chinese, and other languages, and whereas linguistic and pedagogic study have demonstrated that the cherishing of a people's language of heritage in no way threatens the status of English as the common language of most Oklahomans and of public discourse in Oklahoma, and whereas 1/3 of all Oklahoma Indian languages have already become extinct in our state, and whereas all of Oklahoma's remaining Indian languages are endangered, be it therefore resolved that the state of Oklahoma assures all Oklahomans that 1. The state of Oklahoma takes pride in the history and culture of Oklahoma's Indian people as expressed in their languages of heritage, and considers those languages a treasured part of the heritage of our state and of the individual tribes of our state. The state of Oklahoma seeks to preserve, this is number 2, the state of Oklahoma seeks to preserve, protect, and promote our Indian language heritage. 3, the state of Oklahoma encourages the teaching and learning of our Indian languages at all levels, from preschool to university, with the same seriousness of effort and for the same academic credit as any foreign language. 4, the state of Oklahoma directs the superintendent of instruction to ensure that schools throughout our state have no policy forbidding, ridiculing, or relegating to inferior status any Indian language or students or staff who use any Indian language, and that any student experiencing such disrespect for their language will have avenues for immediate redress. 5, the state of Oklahoma will not pass any law that intentionally or unintentionally suppresses Indian languages, limits their use, or threatens their continued existence as living languages. And 6, no provision of this act is meant to negate or undermine the importance of the English language to all Oklahomans. Of course, that last little paragraph there was designed to help people calm down if they thought, oh my gosh, it should be English only. What is this about Indian languages? In other words, we were emphasizing that this isn't an either-or proposition. Obviously, we're going to have English as the main language in Oklahoma for the foreseeable future. This is English plus, to use a phrase used by an organization promoting the use of English and of minority languages. So that was the original OILHPH that we came up with, Oklahoma Indian Language Heritage Protection Act. And we tried to get this through the legislature for the first time in 2000. We found some supporters, and whenever you try to do anything through the legislature, if you're not used to it, as I'm not a person with a lot of political experience, you kind of learn the ropes as you go. And in this first year, last year when we first introduced this measure and tried to get it brought to a vote, we learned a lot, but we weren't successful. Basically what happened is we introduced it very late in the session. You know, the Oklahoma legislative session only runs from early February to late May, and I think we brought it up in late March or April maybe, and said, hey, can we get this through? We figured, it's just a fairly simple thing. There was no money that had to be budgeted for anything specifically in this measure, so we thought it might be able to go through pretty quickly. We found a couple of senators and representatives who said, yeah, well, we'll support that, sure, we'll be glad to do that. And then I guess I kind of waited to hear, well, when is our thing coming up for a vote? And no one called. The phone didn't ring. Felt like someone waiting for a date that wasn't going to happen. And then at the last minute, we couldn't get a hold of the right people, and pretty soon the legislature was over, and it always gets hectic at the end of the session. So to make a long story short, the legislative session ended, and our measure didn't come up for a vote at all. We had done some publicity, handing out copies of this at our celebration and other places where Wordpath Society has little handouts and things, booths at events. So we were kind of getting a little publicity that it would be a good idea to have a measure like this, but basically it died in the legislature. That ended in May of 2000. Now, let me just say a little bit about the content before we go on. The measure explicitly mentioned the NALA, or Native American Language Act, which is a federal law passed in 1990 that says a lot of the same things. It says, hey, to summarize it very briefly, it says, hey, Indian languages are great, they're important to people, gives some of the reasons, a lot of kind of whereas clauses, why they're important, how important they are. And it says, it ends by saying, so we encourage people to maintain their languages, we don't ever want to interfere with that, we encourage them to teach them, learn them, et cetera, et cetera. It was also just a very beautiful statement of support by the federal government, which was long overdue in 1990. And a lot of Indian people and people working with Indian languages were pleased to see that, but of course they immediately said, yeah, but what does this really do? It's just a statement. It's a nice statement, but it doesn't help us save our languages. So a year or two later, I believe it was in 1991, the second NALA, or Native American Language Act, came out, which did have a provision to make some money available for language preservation programs around the country for Native American languages, Indian, Native Hawaiian, etc. And that is in effect to this day. Those are the famous ANA grants. They are administered through the Administration for Native Americans in the Department of Health and Human Services. So there is some money available each year for tribes around the country and other Native peoples to apply for grants to work on preserving their languages. And that's been going on for some years now. Gosh, I guess it's almost 10 years. So that's the Native American Languages Act referred to. And as I say, a lot of the wording is similar to what we had in our proposed measure. And again, we did, as we were writing this, one of the reasons we made it a priority to come up with some kind of statement of this sort at the time we did is because we said, gee, you know, this English-only thing, there's a movement around the country to have English-only statements pass the state legislatures. They've been to Oklahoma once and it was defeated, but we know they'll be back. And maybe if we could get something passed before they come back that specifically says it wants to protect Indian languages, then maybe that will kind of insulate Oklahoma Indian languages against any harm that an English-only measure might do somewhere down the pike. Well, sure enough, this had no sooner been introduced and fizzled out in the legislature last year than here come the English-only people. Last summer, I think it was around June of 2000, that they were circulating petitions, an initiative petition. They had failed to get the measure through the legislature and decided to go the other route, which is to have a citizens petition, have citizens sign a petition for an initiative that would then be put on the ballot, you know, based on the request of the citizens, regardless of what the legislators wanted. So they were trying a different tack with the English-only movement. And we did a couple of shows, 3-4 shows, I think, about this English-only initiative since that time, in the last year approximately. The brief history of that was that the petition was circulated in the summer of 2000. The proponents, including Senator Martin of Comanche, I believe, and Representative Ron Kirby of Lawton, had intended that this measure, if it got enough signatures, which it apparently did, would be placed on the ballot in November, on the main presidential ballot last November. But what happened after that is that there were a number of challenges. There were 11 letters that were written. There's always a period when you have an initiative petition like this. There's a period once the petition has been accepted by the state and it's being considered whether it's going to go on the ballot. There's a 10-day period during which the public may mount any challenges they care to, state any reasons why they think it should not go on the ballot. And there were 11 of us that wrote letters. I was one, and some other friends of mine, and other people around the state wrote letters basically to the Supreme Court saying, please don't put this measure on the ballot. There's no point in doing it because it's unconstitutional. Of course, we don't like it, but what the court wanted to hear, apparently what the court wants to hear in this kind of challenge, is that the law, if it is passed, will not be enforceable because it's against, in some way, in violation of the federal Constitution or the Oklahoma Constitution or some other very major legal principle. So then the state would reason, well, if they agreed that it was in violation of constitutional provisions or other major laws, then they could save the whole state a lot of money by not putting it on the ballot, having it maybe pass, and then having it defeated in the courts after all of this electioneering and the expense that it takes to put it on the ballot. So several of us, 11 of us, did mount a challenge to this, sent in our letters. And then there was a lot of legal back and forth throughout the fall and into about January, where attorneys for Senator Martin, apparently Representative Kirby dropped out of the process, but attorneys for Senator Martin from an organization called English Only in Washington, D.C., kept asking the court to expedite the process because they wanted English Only on the ballot in November, and time was running out with all these challenges, and they were very impatient with those of us who had objections to it. Kept trying to get the court to hurry up, and some of us 11 letter writers got our own attorneys. Some, like myself, were not able to, but there were several attorneys involved on the opponent's side. So we had the proponents' attorneys from English Only and the opponents representing various of these 11 letter writers, different attorneys from Oklahoma. The ACLU got involved. Cherokee Nation was involved, and there were a number of legal briefs on behalf of some of the 11 letter writers, and amicus curiae briefs by organizations like ACLU, just wanting to get in their 2 cents worth to the court, make sure that the court considered all the issues that they felt were important. Of course, the ACLU is very big on First Amendment freedom of speech issues, which I think every one of the 11 letters, including mine, mentioned that as one reason why it should not go on the ballot. Well, to make that long story as short as possible, that process is still not quite over. The motion by the proponents to expedite the process was denied, so it did not go on the November ballot, which meant at that point, if the initiative was not defeated in the court, that it would go on the next statewide ballot, which at that point was thought to be about 2 years away, the next congressional elections. Now it looks like there will be a statewide ballot sooner. I believe this September there's going to be a statewide vote on right to work and some other things. So it could still conceivably go on the ballot as soon as this coming September. It's right in the final stages now. All of the briefs have been received. All the proponents have had a chance to say what they wanted to say. The opponents have had their say. And it's now with the Supreme Court. And they're either reading and studying right now, or it's on the docket waiting to come up and be considered. They have a lot of things to consider, I'm sure. So we don't know when we'll hear the final word on that. But as soon as all that process with the New English Only initiative started going on, we were really, really glad that we had already sort of started the wheels moving on the Indian Language Heritage Protection Act. And we said, boy, this time in the next legislature, which began this past February of 2001, we're going to make sure we get this thing in on day one. We're going to get our sponsors in the Senate and the House lined up, and we're going to stay right on top of it and make sure it comes up for a vote this time. So we did that. We submitted it to the legislature in February, and we came up with the following supporters. They're called authors in each house. The Senate authors were Ted Fisher from Sapulpa. He's the principal author, so he's the one that would introduce it from the floor of the Senate. And also his co-author, I guess they're called, or something like that. The other Senate author was Senator Cal Hobson from Lexington, I believe. And they were both very strong in their support, and we really appreciated their help. On the House side, the principal author was Opio Toure, a representative from Oklahoma City, and the other authors were Bill Nations from Norman and Kenneth Korn from Howe out in eastern Oklahoma in LaFleur County. It turns out that Representative Howe, I'll tell a little bit of an anecdote here. A couple of weeks ago, we got all this process started in February this time, made a few phone calls, and Senator Fisher's office was just swamped with other measures, money measures, and just all kinds of major things that had been in committee and there were big fights about. And they said, look, let us get some of this other stuff out of the way. Our resolution is pretty quick. Keep calling us, but it's going to be a little while. So we called through February and March and April, and towards the end of April they said, it's coming soon, we're going to get this thing on the floor. And finally in May, well, just last week, I guess it was, no, week before last, around mid-May, Leroy Seeley, who is the Choctaw instructor at OU, went with me up to the Capitol, and we thought we'd better visit Senator Fisher and some of our other supporters in person. And he was also going to talk to his senator and representative. Mine happened to already be on our list. And so we visited around and talked to a number of different senators and representatives. They were all very cordial about it, and I think by that time they actually did have a written version of the bill. Part of the process when you submit something like this to the legislature and you find someone who was willing to support it and introduce it is, I think they never introduce it exactly as is. It goes to a staff member who works at the legislature. They have a number of these people who their job is to write bills. And so they take what you've given them, make any needed corrections, put it into the proper legalese language, give it the right kind of title and phraseology and so forth. And then the bill gets a number, and then it comes to be voted on eventually. So by the time Leroy Seeley and I went up, they had given us our first version, a draft of this resolution. It no longer had our title on it. I guess we had to give up on that. It was just called Senate Concurrent Resolution. And what that terminology means is that a concurrent resolution is a resolution that's passed by both houses. You can have a simple Senate resolution or a House resolution, or a concurrent resolution, which is something that will be voted on by both houses, and that's what we wanted to have. It's called a Senate Concurrent Resolution, meaning that it starts first in the Senate and then the House concurs when they vote on it. So there was a little bit of misunderstandings at the beginning. It had been set up as simply a Senate resolution, and we really wanted it to go to both houses. We wanted to have the entire legislature vote on this so that we had the sense of both houses and had both of them on record saying that they supported Indian languages. So that came to draft 2. They changed it from a simple Senate resolution to a Senate Concurrent Resolution. It got its number. There were a few changes in the wording. I thought it might be worth just mentioning a few of those. They didn't change too much of the wording. A lot of it sounds just like our original. But let me mention a few things that were changed. One thing, this is kind of interesting from the linguistic point of view as regards English language. Everywhere where we had said Indian, they changed that word to the phrase Native American. And that's just kind of a politically correct thing, I guess, that's done in all legislation. Of course, I pointed out to the staff member who was writing it, I said, you know, Native American and Indian don't exactly mean the same thing. There are people who are Native American but not Indian. But I didn't want to make too much of a point out of that, because after all, it did make it match the wording of the federal Native American Language Act, and that was a kind of a nice match that read well, and it's just something that the legislature wanted us to do, so we said, fine, change it all to Native American, which they did. We also decided to change the number of tribes from 38 to 39. That had been my mistake, I think. I got on the website of the Oklahoma Indian Affairs Commission and counted the tribes that they listed, and we went with that. What else did we change? Another major thing that they did throughout the measure, we didn't really think it was such a major thing, but it's interesting that the person writing this legislation thought that this would be a good idea. He seemed to be on our side, and he wanted the legislation basically to say what we wanted it to say, but you know, it has to be done properly and so forth. And he could foresee, we had mentioned the term English or English language in the resolution at several points, because as I pointed out, we were all thinking about these English-only measures and the possible dangers that they could pose to Native American languages. So English was very much on our mind, and we had mentioned it, and he said, look, we just decided we better take that word out, because it might sort of push some buttons and get some people who are very strongly pro-English only thinking that it's not such a good resolution. We think it'll have a better chance of passing if we take that out. So wording was substituted that said, like, the language of most Oklahomans, or the majority language or something like that in a few places, and we felt that that was all right too. There were a couple of places where they had wanted to change languages and cultures to language and culture, and I said, no, I think we want that changed back, because a lot of people believe in this myth that there's one Indian language or there's one Indian culture, and that's a major point that our organization likes to make, to kind of educate people about that a little bit. And you know, there is this large number of 25 languages. It's not just Indian language. So in most cases, they put the S back on that. And another change that was kind of interesting towards the end, there was one really strong a closing paragraph that we wanted to have in it. Apparently it's just not legally possible, and that's where we had said roughly the legislature will never pass any law in any way interfering with or limiting the use, etc., of Indian languages. He said we can't do that. The only way you could get such a global thing, you know, affecting all future laws into effect would be if you wrote a constitutional amendment and got that passed, which is an idea for later maybe. So that paragraph was taken out entirely, and then they added one which we had not asked for or expected that says, this is the final paragraph, where it says, be it now resolved that, blah, blah, blah. The last that says that a copy of this resolution be distributed to the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the Executive Director of the Intertribal Wordpath Society. Made me mighty proud. So those are some of the changes and some of the process. I just wanted to recount a little bit of that because it has been a long process. And you can see now, I think on camera now, you see the final page. We got this 4-page document just arrived in the mail today, the official final copy of the resolution. I noticed it doesn't even have the number on it. It just says resolution on the first page. On the first page are listed all of the people who signed on to the bill. And this was an interesting kind of a plus that we hadn't expected, and I didn't know that the system worked this way. But when it was first read in the Senate, Senator Fisher stood up on the floor of the Senate and said, I'd like the clerk please to read this resolution, and you know, which the clerk did. He took some time. It's a couple of pages long, a lot of whereases and a lot of that clauses, and it took 5 or 10 minutes to read the whole thing, which he did. And then there was a vote. It was just not a vote by name. It was just all in favor say aye, and all opposed say nay. No one said nay. And then Senator Fisher said, and I don't remember the exact legal terminology that they used, but he said in effect, well, I'd like to move that all senators be listed as being in favor, or be listed as authors, I believe was the phrase he used, and hearing no opposition. That part was passed, which means that before this final thing was finally written up to be signed by all the state authorities, the name of every one of the 48 senators was added to this resolution as supporting it. And the same thing happened in the House. In the House, they were a little more rushed that day, I think. They didn't have the clerk read the measure. They just said, well, there's this Senate Concurrent Resolution 37. We'd like members to support it. There was a quick, aye and nay vote. No opposition expressed there either. They didn't read it through in the House, which is a little bit of a disappointment. But the great thing about that was that was the second vote. That was the final vote that said, okay, now we've got it passed. And so all of this finally happened on Monday. May the 21st was the House vote. The Senate vote had been on May 17th. You might want to take a moment to thank the legislators who put this resolution forward. Senators Fisher and Hobson, Representatives Touray, Nations, and Corn, especially if you live in one of their districts. Even if you don't, I think it would be really wonderful for people to send letters to Senator Ted Fisher at the state capitol in Oklahoma City and Representative Opio Touray in the House of Representatives, just to thank them for having made this possible. Of course, this is just a first step. We might want to consider, and it'll take a lot more work, but we might want to consider trying to get in an amendment to the Oklahoma Constitution that would really, really make more permanent and very strongly stated and permanent protections for Indian languages in Oklahoma. And we need to look into the possibility of maybe getting another bill into the legislature next year, which, sort of like the second part of the Native American Languages Act at the federal level, will say, okay, we have this nice sentiment in the 2001 resolution. Now we want to have a resolution or a bill, I think it would be called then, that will allot some money to help Indian tribes and communities in their language preservation programs. Perhaps that's the next best step. If anyone would like to get involved with this process, please call us at the Wordpath Society. Our number's at the end of the show. Then maybe we can get some funding at the state level. So once again, as I said at the end of the last show, I believe, or a recent show, they said it couldn't be done, but again, they were wrong. It can. Events like this just give me a lot of cause for optimism. So, see you next time on WordPath. Oh, before we go, I had one more comment I wanted to make, if I may. It goes like this. We made it.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita.